Hey everyone, Zach from the barbellphysio.com and performanceplusprogramming.com. If you're trying to improve your squats or reduce knee or low back pain by improving your hip mobility, I've got you covered in this video where we're gonna hit the 5 best hip mobility exercises. Before we jump into the exercises, I think the biggest key anytime we're trying to improve our mobility is to make sure we're actually addressing the correct area. So for example, in the hip, our hips can flex and extend. They can externally rotate and internally rotate. They can abduct and adduct. And if your hips are tight, but you're not actually addressing the area where they're most restricted, then you're gonna really struggle. You're gonna spin your wheels and you're not gonna make the progress that you want. So for that, I have an absolute free resource for you. That is our ultimate mobility checklist. That will be linked in the description of this video, but that takes you through a ton of different tests so that you actually work on the areas that you need. You'll get less time needs to be done to improve your mobility, but you'll get more benefits. All right, let's jump into our first exercise. And this is going to be a modification of the pigeon stretch. So everybody does the pigeon stretch when their hips feel tight, and I really hate the way most people perform it, where they're just dropping down, they're letting their back round. And what we have to appreciate when we do that is if your back is rounding, your pelvis is gonna posteriorly tilt. You're not gonna be getting as effective of a stretch on your hips. So I really prefer to have my athletes do this posterior capsule stretch instead. They typically feel that it's a much more intense stretch and they'll see faster improvements in their mobility. So how we do that? We're gonna start on our hands and knees. We're gonna stretch my right hip for this one. I'm gonna kick my left leg back, knees directly underneath my hip, but I'm gonna spin that leg in so I can externally rotate that leg, and then I'm gonna shift my hips to the side. And when I shift my hips to the side, I'll feel some tension on my lateral hip. Then I'm gonna keep my chest really tall and sit back. And what you'll find is that you don't have to sit back very far to get a really deep and intense stretch on the backside of this hip. Now, if you do what most people do where they round their back, you'll then notice that you have to go super far down to find any stretch. So that combination of rotating the hip out, shifting your hips to the side, and then keeping a tall spine will create a much more effective stretch on the hips for you. My second favorite stretch is gonna be our hip internal rotation mobilization with movement. So I'm gonna get a large resistance band and I'm gonna get it around the upright of a squat rack. So we're gonna go after the opposite direction of the hip here, the internal rotation, which is so often completely neglected by people working on their hip mobility and can pay huge dividends. If you always find that you have to do the pigeon stretch to make your hips feel loose, but they just don't stay loose between sessions, so often a little bit of hip internal rotation work will have a huge effect. So I've got this band as high up my thigh as I can go, as close to my hip joint as I can, and then I'm gonna slide out. So that band's pulling straight laterally away from my body, and then I lay on my back. And I'm gonna have my knee directly over my hip, and I'm simply gonna work on pushing my foot out as far as I can go. And I can do that actively. I can do it with a little active assist by putting my hands on my thigh and helping to turn that a little bit more. Or at times, I'll also take a PVC pipe and kind of twist it around my leg. And now I can let that PVC pipe really help to leverage and pull me into some more internal rotation. A lot of times I'll pull and then let go of my hand assistance and just try to hold it in position there so that I'm getting that passive stretch, but then I'm working on that active in-range control, which can be a huge game changer in terms of, I like to think of that as like hitting save on a Word document. You're not gonna write a 20-page paper without saving it multiple times. Those in-range contractions are a great way to hit save. So that's hitting hip internal and external rotation. But for a lot of athletes, they just need generally better hip overall mobility. And so a lot of times I'll superset those exercises with 90-90 rotations, which is just a great general hip mobility stretch. So I'm gonna sit spine tall with one leg sitting where that thigh is perpendicular to my pelvis and the other where it's parallel. I'm gonna stay nice and upright. My hands are gonna be on the ground to try to keep more of that upright position. I'm gonna lift that back leg up as high as I can go. It won't go very far, but when I run out of motion, now I'm gonna start turning towards that leg. And I'm gonna try to keep my 2 knees as far apart from each other as they can, and myself as pushed up as I possibly can while keeping my spine tall. If you're a little less mobile, you'll just be leaned back a little bit more than I am. If you're more mobile, you'll sit upright. But those knees are trying to stay apart from each other the entire time as I slowly rotate side to side. This is not a fast movement. We're really trying to slowly control these awkward in-range positions. And I absolutely love 90-90 rotations for athletes that just need, in general, more mobility, especially for those athletes that I kind of feel like we'd see some benefit if we got them to widen their squat stance out a little bit. That's, in general, athletes with stiffer ankles or athletes with longer thighs in relationship to their torso. A wider stance often helps those athletes out, and 90-90 rotations is great for that. Another exercise that's also great for helping you to widen your stance out in your squat, if you need that, are adductor rockbacks. So these are gonna be exercise number 4. So I'm gonna start on my hands and knees, and I'm gonna rock forward a little bit, and then kick one leg out to the side. And then I'm gonna keep my spine tall as I sit down, finding a big stretch through my groin. And I'm simply just gonna rock up and down with each of those. I would hit this on both sides as well. All right, our final hip mobility exercise are gonna be psoas eccentric. So many athletes complain of hip flexor tightness, but what's so commonly I find is that athletes are actually weaker in their hip flexors, and they've been stretching those hip flexors for a long time, but not really making progress. So I like to do this movement because it is a combination of a strength movement with a stretch at the exact same time. So we get two birds with one stone. Now, if you're lucky and you have ankle cuffs or you have something like monkey feet, you can use those for this. Most of the time, the athletes that I work with don't have those pieces of equipment. So what I instead have them do is take a small resistance band, like a little mini band loop, and then I put it through a dumbbell and hold it up. So now I have this little U-shaped thing that's holding my dumbbell, and all I have to do is slide that on top of my foot. Then I'm gonna get on a box or a bench. I'm using a box because I'm a bit taller, and I'm gonna hug one knee towards my chest. That's gonna keep my back flat so that all my motion comes from my hip joint. Knee's gonna stay bent, and I'm just gonna slowly lower that down, usually about 3 to 4 seconds down. Hold that bottom position for 1 second, and then pull it up. So we're getting that slow eccentric, and then pause at in range. And then lift that up. You can also do this the opposite direction if you want a bit more of a strength challenge. So instead, you take an incredibly heavy dumbbell that can hold your feet in place, lock your feet underneath that, and then do the reverse where you're now lying back or falling backwards. And that's gonna do the same thing. We're gonna get an eccentric contraction on those hip flexors to both strengthen them and mobilize them. So those are my 5 favorite exercises for improving your hip mobility. Again, make sure you're actually working on the right areas. So take advantage of that ultimate mobility checklist. The description's down below. And then if you want a proven program to improve your hip joint mobility, that's gonna help your squat depth and those functional movement patterns that we all really care about, then head to performanceplusprogramming.com and check out our hip mobility overhaul that has helped thousands of athletes improve their mobility and their performance inside of the gym.